The death of a woman in custody sparks fury on the streets of Iran. As a crackdown on protests claims more lives, social media networks are restricted. Could this round of civil unrest mark a turning point for change in the Islamic Republic? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Iran's protests. The death of a 22-year-old Iranian woman in police custody has fueled widespread anti-government protests. There have been demonstrations across more than 15 cities in Iran, with at least 8 protesters and a police officer killed. The movement has prompted women around the world to post videos of themselves cutting their hair in solidarity, while in Iran, some have been filmed burning their headscarves. The government has, of course, tried to stop them, arresting protesters and heavily restricting access to the internet. There are reports of law enforcement even raiding private homes. And Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi has warned protesters that acts of chaos are unacceptable. But Iranians are angry. Last week, Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police in Tehran for allegedly not wearing her hijab correctly. Amini collapsed while in custody, fell into a coma, and died in the hospital 3 days later. Iranian officials claim she had a pre-existing health condition, but her family says she was perfectly healthy. According to the London-based broadcaster Iran International, after obtaining Amini's medical scan, it was concluded she died from a blow to the head. Meanwhile, the Iranian government denies the allegations, saying that so far there is no evidence Mahsa Amini was beaten.
So far, there are no reports of beating of Mahsa Amini by overseeing bodies. We were closely watching this issue to see if there has been any beating. Technically, morality police officers have no tool for beating. They have no batons nor any other tool. There are a number of women police officers dealing with women arrested for loose hijab.
Wearing a headscarf and looser-fitting clothing has been compulsory for women in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The morality police were, in part, founded to enforce that dress code. But that force has been criticized, especially in recent years, because of its disproportionate scrutiny of women. In 2017, dozens of women publicly removed their headscarves in a wave of protests, but the official response then was to adopt tougher measures. Hardliners in the country called for harsh punishment, arguing that allowing women to show their hair leads to moral decay and the degradation of families. Iran's judiciary has, in certain instances, encouraged people to report women who don't wear the hijab. But the aftermath of Amini's death could be different. According to some sources, even regime supporters are criticizing the dress code's enforcement. Amini's death has drawn condemnation from all over the world, highlighting Iran's treatment of women. The United States has sanctioned Iran's morality police, saying they are responsible for Amini's death. The United Nations demanded an independent investigation into the incident and called for the repeal of regulations that impose the hijab.
The authorities must stop targeting, harassing, and detaining women who do not abide by the hijab rules. Nada al-Nashif is calling for the repeal of all discriminatory laws and regulations that impose mandatory hijab.
Now, this is obviously not the first time mass protests in Iran have garnered international attention. But could this round lead to the change protesters actually want? Joining me now to debate that are from Washington, Sussan Tahmasebi. She is an Iranian women's rights activist and the executive director of FEMENA. Also from the U.S. Capitol is Iranian-American journalist Negar Mortazavi. And from Isfahan, Iran, is political analyst and researcher Setareh Sadeqi. Thanks all so much for being with us. Setareh, I'll start with you because you are in Iran. I'm not sure just how much is actually happening in Isfahan itself, but if you can, just give us a sense of what it feels like in the country right now and how it feels to see especially women standing up in a protest like this.
Right. So people, especially women, were very angry with what happens to Mahsa Amini, and they took to the streets. I mean, it's not just this one case. A lot of things that have happened before. made Iranian women angry at how the morality police is acting and enforcing the hijab law. And they wanted to take to the streets to protest the morality police. But at this point, I would say the protesters are demanding totally different things, and it has become very violent. And I should also tell you that in my city, in Esfahan, the protests are very, very small, unlike what, for example, I witnessed in 2019, where the protests for the fuel prices were really massive, and we had huge protests in Isfahan too. But this year, I've seen, or my family members and my friends have seen, maybe gatherings of around 50 people, less than 100 people. I'm talking about Isfahan. That's not the case in Tehran and in some other cities, even smaller cities than Isfahan. But
are you impressed, though?
Like
I mean, personally, are you impressed with whom you've seen take to the streets? Because it's not necessarily safe to protest on these issues in Iran.
Yes, I have had friends who took part in the protest, and they filmed the things what was happening in Esfahan, and they told me that the gatherings were very small in Esfahan. I'm not talking about the entire country, and it's because this is an issue. The issue of morality police is something that also has to do with the provincial cultures and a lot of like local cultures. Also, it's not like, for example, the fuel prices, which affected everyone, and everyone wanted to be, I mean, a larger proportion of the population wanted to be part of it. So it's different. And by now, because many of the protesters have already, for example, burned 61 ambulances, have killed police officers, and it got more violent than, I would say, what I personally witnessed in 2019. So a lot of people don't want to be a part of that. They are talking about it. They are calling for morality police to be removed, for changes in the hijab law policy, but they don't want to be a part of this violent riots that are going on.
Let me turn to Sussan. I mean, watching from abroad, tell us how much you actually admire what some of these women are doing. I mean, because tell us about what you think people really have to fear, and what do you fear about, what could happen to the women in these protests and those that are being seen in these videos actually burning their hijabs, for example?
Well, I admire very much the Iranian women and, their supporters who've gone to the streets at great, huge risks to themselves to protest the mandatory hijab, to protest the violent enforcement of mandatory hijab, and to ask for accountability, really demand accountability in the senseless and violent death of this beautiful young woman at the prime of her life. Women are fed up. They're sick and tired of having their bodies controlled it's controlled in a multitude of ways. The hijab is probably one of the most visible ways of control and one of the most violent ways of control, but it is controlled. And I think they're really fed up. Iranians in general are fed up with the lack of accountability of police, how police have, and security forces attack them, how violently they treat them, how they kill them without any accountability whatsoever. So I think this is also part of the reason for the fueling of these protests. But I do want to say something that, a lot of protests, and we've seen instances where in videos where people are attacking police, but the violence predominantly in all of the protests are initiated and largely by the police. Oftentimes we have plainclothes security officers in the crowd that create the violence, and then they blame it on the protesters. Largely, Iranians have been very peaceful, and especially women. We see that they're extremely peaceful. They're standing up against security forces that are arresting them, that are forcibly abducting them, that are beating them. We've seen, and shooting guns at them, but they're burning their scarves. That's what they're doing. So their actions are extremely peaceful. And I do take really serious note with the fact that to blame the violence on protesters, because protesters in Iran have time and again shown that they are peaceful, except for when they're defending themselves. And the violence is almost entirely often by security forces, and including plainclothes security officers who act like they're regular protesters.
Okay,
So
understood.
I think it's really important
There's,
to say that.
yeah, I see you very much. They are very brave. This is a risk, let's just to say the least, for them to take to the streets like this and protest. But Sussan, very quickly, do you think it's worth it?
I think obviously it's worth it that there are people are frustrated enough to go out and to do this. So it must be worth it for them. I hope that it results in some changes. I think unfortunately the Iranian state has refused to listen to its citizens, has refused for 40 years to listen to the demands of women who've asked for changes in discriminatory laws and practices. And it always waits till things turn into a crisis, and then it quells that crisis with repression and violence. But I hope that this time that the protesters actually achieve some of their demands, which is the reversal of the mandatory hijab laws, and then the elimination of the morality police and accountability for the death of Mahsa.
Okay. Negar, I want to ask you specifically about this angle, because we were hearing from Setareh that this was, the action taken by the morality police. That is who these protesters have the issue with in this case. But there is a danger, in a sense, that the government will use the morality police as a scapegoat of sorts. And if they do make changes, it might be minimal changes to the morality police when these protests really are about something much bigger and institutional.
Well, that's correct, but it's also, if past precedent shows, change is difficult and change doesn't always immediately come after these kind of protests. Yes, there's a lot of anger, and it's built up anger, layers of anger over the years. Women have been resisting and fighting the morality police individually over the years, and this is sort of a collective anger that's pouring out with the death of Mahsa Amini, essentially saying enough is enough. Now the violence of the morality police has become lethal. Now women are not only subjected to beating and arrest, they could also die in the custody of the morality police. Women see themselves in Mahsa Amini. Men see their own sisters in Mahsa Amini. So I think that's where the anger is coming from, and people see no avenue to pursue this because they've been calling for it for years. So beyond the street and beyond protesting, there's really no avenue to pursue this. So that's the outpouring of anger. What I find significant this time also is that some religious Iranians are joining. I've seen campaigns online of hijabi women saying, I am hijabi, I observe it, but I oppose the morality police. I'm seeing some religious scholars, including a Grand Ayatollah, saying, don't do this. This is immoral. This is irrational. This is not how you make people accept a virtue or a value or a religious belief. Don't force it on people with lethal violence. So I'm hoping that this would be a turning point or sort of a wake-up call to the authorities to abolish the morality police, to remove this violent force of really harassment against women on the street. I don't know if Setareh, for example, has ever been stopped by them, but I'm hearing instances of religious women even being stopped by morality police. Those who observe the hijab in the private of their homes go on the street and get harassed by the morality police. But I'm just hoping this would be a watershed moment and we will see some change, if not immediately, at least in the long term, in how this is being enforced so violently.
Sounds like that is the hope. Setareh, let me ask you then, as for what the question Negar was posing, have you ever been hassled yourself by the morality police?
No, obviously I haven't, because I observe the hijab as part of what I believe in. But my friends have been, and whenever I was with them, I go and talk to the morality police. I mean, it has happened, at least I can remember 3 times that my friends were stopped. And I just went up and talked to the morality police and told them that as someone who believes in hijab, I'm against it. And that's a good point that Negar mentioned. There is this discourse now shaped, even on the state TV, that a lot of people are questioning the function of morality police and how it has made a lot of women and men to be angry at what the state is doing in terms of enforcing the law. But one thing that I wanted to mention is, like, firstly, I think it's easy to say that it's worth it taking to the street and taking the risk when you're not living in Iran. And that's one thing that a lot of Iranians have been saying, that if you're not I'm not talking about Sussan in particular. I'm talking about those people who called for, like Iranian expats in particular, who called for Iranian women to take the streets and even sometimes to carry out very violent acts like attacking the police officers who are also on just duty. I mean, I'm against them, but burning down like ambulances in a country that is under sanctions and has difficulties providing those ambulances to its people is not something that real protesters do. And I want to say that, yes, a lot of the protesters are very peaceful, even when the police attack them. But in which country in the world do you see that police officers are killed and attacked and they don't take action? Like, obviously they don't stand by and just look at what's happening. They take action, and it's violent. And another point to make is
before you go on, let me let
surprise.
Sussan respond to the point you just made. Sussan, go ahead.
This is not about police being killed. It's about a woman being killed in custody. It's not the first time. It's not the first time that ordinary citizens who've been arrested for their human rights activities, for their peaceful activities, have been killed in custody with no police accountability. Or I bet you that ordinary citizens did not put fire to ambulances. This is the work of security forces to create violence in an otherwise peaceful demonstration.
Of course they did, but I wouldn't say they are necessarily the ones. I mean, they could be. I'm not saying I mean, I don't know. You don't know if they were police police in plain clothes, or they were some people who were paid to hijack the protest, the peaceful protest, because
I have been
my friends who took part
hijack.
Yeah, it's easy to say because you're not living here.
No.
I walk downtown. I walk downtown and I see everything. I've seen leaders.
Okay, hold on 1 second, Setareh, because Sussan's sound is completely cut out. Sussan, do go ahead quickly.
I'm sorry. Please do not do that you do not live there. I do not. It's not that I don't live there by choice. Okay, I live there. I work there for many years, and I worked on these issues with women's rights defenders. So please do not do that. I've never called for anybody to go out and protest, but if people are going out and protesting, I'm going to support them. I'm not going to say it's not worth it. And do not create a division here, because that I don't, that's really unfair, because I could create a division and say you belong to the ideology of the state, so you can't talk about, I could do that. So please do not dismiss my right to have an opinion about this. I have been in Iran when
I don't know why. I mean, I mentioned a few times
peaceful protests
that I am against the morality police, but you don't want to hear that part.
No, but
you don't want to hear that part.
I think the point of
violence, and it is not the protesters that are the violence. It's the state that's violent.
I even said that
the state that's
there are people among the protesters.
Yeah, this happens in mass protest movements all over the world, actually, the phenomenon that Sussan is describing. It's always very difficult to know who really is responsible. Yes. It becomes almost impossible to investigate.
Exactly. So you can't it's not that easy to blame it on security forces or on the people. And I have to mention again, although I said it a few times, that there are people within the peaceful protesters. I didn't say the protesters are violent. I said there are people who just hijacked wherever they come from. They hijacked the protest, the legitimate protest that Iranian women had. And I should also mention that this is the first time that I see a lot of I don't know, like Hollywood celebrities or people who in foreign leaders, political leaders, who in their own countries, people like, for example, take the US, 3 people die every day in police custody and no one talks about them. And they are in no moral position to talk about what happens in Iran or show support. But this time, even though the protests are much smaller than what we saw in 2019 when the working class were protesting, they are it's so exaggerated exaggerated online, and you will think that a revolution is happening any moment, but that's not the case. I am totally
Okay.
against the morality police. I told you, I have my friends arrested by morality police, and I object that. And I have, you can go to my Twitter and see how many times in Persian I have protested and showed how I am
Okay.
really sad and grieving the death of
Setareh,
Mahsa Amini.
yes,
And
you made the point.
everyone
I apologize. We have very limited time, and I do want to try to give equal time to everybody. Negar, I'm very sorry. I'm going to come back to you right now because as we talk about, and Setareh has mentioned this several times, she believes these protests are really not quite as significant as the ones we saw in 2019. So I want to ask you about that. The wider issues in Iran, protests in the past haven't just been about asking for, greater freedoms and more government transparency. They've also been about the economy. Is all of this, all these factors, are they accumulating now, do you think, because you said you hope to see real change, are they accumulating now to a certain boiling point that could spur genuine reform?
I think there's definitely underlying grievances. We've seen years of protests now. When it was mentioned in 2019 that it was sparked by a hike in fuel prices. There's been economic protests on political issues, social issues. Now this civil society is under a lot of pressure, even artists, filmmakers. We see journalists being arrested. So it's an accumulation of layers of grievances that are mostly not addressed by the state. So if a grievance is not addressed, even if the protest is rolled back and people go back home and there's no change, the next time they come out, it's just one extra layer of what they're protesting and they're angry about. So I think these protests are significant because they're about a women's rights issue, essentially, because women are taking the lead with their scarf, because it's a collective anger against something that women have been fighting for the past 40 years, this kind of enforcement of a religious dress code. But it's definitely building up on grievances and on anger from other issues that haven't been addressed. The Iranian economy is in a really bad state. The political space keeps closing even further. Social and cultural issues, this is part of that. So I think it's an accumulation, and unless these issues are addressed, the younger population doesn't see much prospect or hope for a future that's to come.
Interesting, though, Negar, I'll stick with you for one more second. I mean, the timing of all of this corresponded with the UN General Assembly, as you know, and President Raisi was actually forced to address it. Do you think that's helped these protesters' cause, or could it potentially backfire? Because it did, in many ways, publicly embarrass and anger the government.
Well, from a media perspective, I can say there's a lot more attention on Iran's domestic issue because of the presence at the UN. So the Iranian president, with also the nuclear talks being in the headlines, there's more global attention. But global attention doesn't always necessarily translate into change. Changes mostly come from inside, from the movements on the ground, from bottom up. But the global attention and the solidarity also helps. It sheds a light. It gives people the sense that they're being heard, that people are feeling sympathy for them, their solidarity, and we see statements from global leaders and everything. But it's just difficult to speculate. I'm not sure when and how this change will come.
Setareh, quickly, do you think Raisi is responding the right way? I mean, as you know as well, he did cancel a high-profile interview with Christiane Amanpour in New York because she actually declined to wear a headscarf. Also address why you think he did that and what kind of message is he sending?
I really have no comment on that. I don't know why he did that, because previous Iranian president who accepted interviews with Christiane Amanpour in New York and while on their trip in the U.S. and there was an issue. So I have really no idea, and I would like to hear an explanation why he did that. I think he partially, like, he contacted Mahsa Amini's family and talked to them, but in general, I think the state television, the president, and those responsible could have responded a lot better, and they have. In some ways, willingly or unwillingly, fueled the protest, and they have made people more angry.
Okay.
And that's something that they have to, review and see. And
okay, we only have about a
yeah.
minute and a half left, so I'd want to get Sussan's final thoughts on that specifically. How Raisi has responded. Go ahead.
They've never responded in a productive way. What they can do and they should do is to find out, do an independent investigation of what happened to Mahsa and prosecute the people responsible. This is violence that was used. And not only in this case, they've never, ever held any state security force accountable that's killed a citizen. Never, ever, or harmed a citizen, never. And if you speak about it, then they go after you, where they're arresting scores and scores of women human rights defenders, especially in the Kurdish areas, of regular human rights defenders, of journalists. We have lists of over 40 people, 50 people that we know of that are human rights defenders that have been arrested. So this is how they're responding. And they're calling this chaos. So that means that, and they've shut down the internet, which means that when the internet is shut down, there's going to be more and more violence. Lastly, I just want to say, I really appreciate the fact that Turkish women have stood up in support of Iranian women. Kudos to you. Thank you very much. We really are in this fight together, and we want your expression of solidarity. And Iranian women inside the country want it too. Thank you.
Sussan, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated, all of you. And remember, our viewers as well, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.